Shalom, dear friends. Welcome to the continuation of the series, The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, an introduction to the New Testament. And we are in the last part, the Pauline Letters, in these last 3 weeks, November 27, December 4, and December 11. And I have divided this into the whole topic into these 3 weeks. So for November 27, there's the introduction to the study of Paul, and then the world of Paul, then the person of Paul. In part 2, we shall go to the text from the Bible, December 4, and we begin with the Protopolian Letters. This Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, First and Corinthians, and then Romans. And then part 3 for December 11, Pauline Letters, Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, and together with that, of course, the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy, and then Titus. And we shall also study in passing other New Testament books, the letter to the Hebrews and the Catholic epistles. To the introduction, the study of Paul. A question is, who is Paul? And we should have a grasp of first century AD, the world of his New Testament, as background in order to understand Paul. In this course, it is important to know the situation in the time of Paul, like religious situations, like those described in Acts chapter 19. Paul was a man of the city, especially belonging to the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And then we will also take a look at Paul as a theologian. We shall see his different views. We will recognize that he is more of a pastoral theologian than a dogmatic theologian. There are also some terminologies we have to know when we study the letters of Paul. Like, for example, when we speak about the Protopolian Letters, Tritopauline Letters, Tritopauline Letters, and others. Some classifications like captivity letters. And then there's a question about the letter to the Hebrews. But we will go for the last topic, we will have it for when we have studied all the letters of Paul. So that would be on the last meeting. So the Protopolian Letters are those authentically by Paul, and the claim Catholic and Protestant scholars to their authorship by Paul is undisputed. They're also called the Pauline homologumena, from the Greek word homos, the same, and then legein, to speak. And they are the following: the letters of Paul to the Romans, first to the Corinthians, first letter to the Corinthians, his second letter to the Corinthians, and then his letter to the Galatians, his letter to the Philippians, to the Thessalonians, and first letter, Thessalonians, and then Philemon. And many Catholics would consider also Colossians and Second Thessalonians in the list. There's also what we call the Pauline anti-legumena. These are the letters whose authorship is debated and disputed, and the scholars are not unanimous in their opinions regarding this. Both Protopolian and Deuteropauline letters name Paul, that is within the text, as the author of these letters. And they are the following: Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus. And there's also the Tritopauline letters. This is a third category, overlapping the second. And probably they were written already after the death of Paul on account of their theology of ministry, which we see in the letter, which was already very much developed and could not have been of Paul. And they're also the pastoral epistles because they're considered as manuals of pastoral theology. Now, the title, Pastoral Letters, is a convenient designation for these letters. And they are the following: First and Second Timothy, and then Titus. Now, there are other divisions like captivity epistles, where they refer to the letter written in prison. And these are Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philemon. Now, as I was telling you, what about the letter? But we shall expound on this later on. Anyway, just to note right at the beginning that the letter to the Hebrews does not mention Paul as author. Now, if the 14 letters attributed to Paul and then the letter to the Hebrews combined, if they're mentioned, they're called the Pauline corpus. In contrast to when we just take the 13, they're called the Pauline literature. Now, Western Church accepted the letter to the Hebrews as Pauline only in the 4th century. And this was upheld even by St. Jerome. 18th century, that's the period of the Enlightenment. That was a critical period for biblical scholarship. And then the authorship of Paul was questioned. Now, when we go to scholarship today, nobody accepts the letter to the Hebrews as Pauline. We'll see some characteristics later on and the reasons for which the scholars say so. So we're now studying Paul. What are the different approaches when we go into in-depth study? And I think this you have heard from the introduction to the scriptures, the acronic approach, okay, or the historical critical method, and then social scientific criticism. When we look into the situation of Paul, as the situation of Paul, especially the culture and his milieu. And then also we may look at it from the feminist perspective, from the ideological point of view also. And we ask, for example, questions that are formulated in this way: when and where were they written, for whom? Are questions that we have answered in the different topics for this course. Now, apostles, when we study Paul, one thing is sure: we cannot avoid reading the Acts of the Apostles. We are dealing with Paul, and we have seen a lot about Paul when we studied the Acts of the Apostles. It is important in studying the conversion of Paul, especially, and his missionary journeys. And then the letters, however, remain as our primary sources. It's like working on a research paper, on a thesis. The primary sources are those written directly by the subject of your work, and then secondary sources are the literature that are written about. So it's really important in discussing these. It's also important to see the Acts of the Apostles as part of the transition to Paul, who was the writer of the letter. That is the lull after the death of Christ. That was the time that he was writing the letters. Now, we should study Paul and his letters, okay, for these reasons. Why is it significant? Why is it important to study him? Especially as Christians, we see the first works of literature, of Christian literature. So first, quantitatively, because we would miss a lot of our Christian tradition if we neglect Paul. Quantitatively, you see, we would study 13 letters, and that's 13 letters of the 27 books of the New Testament. Second, Paul is an early and direct witness of Christianity, that time when it was still growing. Witness to that. And then liturgical and spiritual importance of Paul, the theological value of Paul, the ecclesiological value of Paul, and in view of the present movements within the church, especially today, particularly the ecumenical movement. For example, the topic of faith and justification in Romans and Galatians and then the charismatic movement. And Paul was an inspiration to the Protestant Reformation. And as I was saying, today in our present in the contemporary church, there are a lot of charismatic movements, and a lot of them take their spring, their source from Paul. But we have difficulties in studying Paul. First, the distance. I'll discuss it in a little while. And then Paul as just part of the whole New Testament or the whole Bible. And then the letters of Paul are not free from being contaminated by outside elements. With regard to always the case when it comes to reading and studying scripture or any literary work for that matter, there's a difficulty in regard to the distance, not only in terms of space, but also time, culture, and other things. And we've seen that when we were looking at the Bible, how important it is to see the context of the writing. Now, there are a lot of things that have to be considered here. So that distance between us and the writer, or even to the community for whom the work was written. First, on the language and culture, when we read Paul, the language is different as well as the culture. It has images that go back to the first century. Sometimes you would see here AD or CE. CE is the common era, already AD. Okay? And then literary forms. There are likewise different literary forms, some of which are not, do not write a letter in this way. Or even, for example, when we write our message in the email. Okay? We also have this difficulty with regard to the distance, the absence of Paul and the communities. That Paul is already gone, and so are the individual communities that he established. They're no longer there, okay? We no longer see them. This raises difficulties of interpreting certain words which Paul and the communities knew and understood, but which we do not. Example, when he speaks about the thorn in the flesh, what was he really talking about? It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for something, but what? Seeing this, we are aware of the danger in taking the following extreme positions. First, fundamentalism, or the overly literal interpretation of the text. Why? Because language develops, evolves. How he has expressed it before is different from what it means for us today, or how it should be expressed today. Second, individual interpretation or reading, or the scripture as the Spirit moves you. So if you're reading it individually, that would make you interpret it by yourself. Okay, so avoid these. So Paul as just a part of the whole New Testament Bible. That's the second difficulty. Why? Because the Bible is really a small library of Christian faith. And so his message is just part of the whole Christian or biblical message. Hence here we find the value of canonical criticism, meaning the message of scripture should be taken from the context of the whole. Now, Paul even sometimes does not jive with the message of other parts of the New Testament. For example, the issue of faith versus good works in his letter to the Romans. And you compare that with the message of the letter of James. It seems to be, they seem to contradict each other. So, task of the theologian to synthesize the message of. And therefore, the rule here is do not absolutize. Another difficulty, even the letters of Paul are not free from being contaminated by outside elements. So probably he wrote them over a period of days. So he was also influenced by his psychological disposition. For example, the transition from 2 Corinthians chapter 9 to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 seemed too abrupt. The contamination of letters also leads to re-editing and addition. That 1 Corinthians 16 seems to have been added later. And then there are also glosses that have been added. Glosses are writings over the original text. And then later on, they have been integrated. And then when you come to read it, that this was an addition, a later addition to the text. Also, another conclusion that we could make now in these difficulties, while we find the study of Paul inevitable, we nevertheless see some difficulties that it entails. Now, here are some materials if ever you want to delve into the study of Paul, that you, first of all, the letters of primary sources, and then the biblical secondary source are the Acts of the Apostles. And then other extra biblical sources are from Philo of Alexandria, Eusebius. Okay, these are extra biblical sources. Other reference materials that aid the Bible scholars: the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament, the Greek-English Lexicon, the Anchor Bible Dictionary, and then the Dictionary of Paul and the Dictionary of Paul and the Letters, concordances. Okay, what is concordances? The list of all the words that are used, both in Greek, and then there are also English concordances. Love, for example, in Paul, how many times does that word appear? Okay, and then maps. Okay, to see, for example, your Bible. It's good. It would have the map of the journeys of Paul, and then commentaries. For Bible dictionaries, Sacra Pagina. Of course, there are those. You also have these commentaries on the other commentaries, apart from Anchor Bible. Individual books that are written about letter of Paul, for example, Romans. Okay, so let's now go to the world of Paul. What are the religious at time? So we have this, we could put it into this outline. There's the worship of the Greco-Roman Pantheon, emperor worship, mystery cults, worship of the occult, Pharisaic Judaism, and then various philosophies. I would go through this very briefly because I think we have studied this in passing when we were into introducing the New Testament. So the first one, the worship of the Greco-Roman Pantheon, this was that Paul had to contend with. Originally, Rome was animistic. There was also belief in many gods and goddesses, and we know that in Greek mythology, okay, there polytheism. Also here, Roman mythology, which draws deeply from Greece. And why is that so? Because there was that contact with Greece, and so the Hellenic gods were deities that were Romanized. And therefore, that was the fusion of two religions. Traditional Greek deities became divinized. Zeus is Jupiter. Zeus in Greek is Jupiter in Rome. Hera became Juno. Poseidon was named Neptune. Artemis was Diana, and so on. Were local celebrations for these Greco-Roman deities. Now, in Acts chapter 19 at Ephesus, Paul had to compete versus the followers of the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the moon and hunting. And Paul went to Ephesus and began preaching. And those in the cult of Artemis reacted against him. So you could read that, okay, in Acts 19. There was also emperor worship that Paul had to contend with, that the imperial cult. There was allegiance to the emperor, and then worship of the emperor was not sanctioned by the Senate till the time of the mission. And this was likewise commanded and demanded by certain emperors, even without the Senate's approval. For example, Caligula. And going back to our study of Mark 13, 14. I think I have mentioned this a while when we were discussing this. In Mark 13:14, there was a reference to that desolating sacrilege. In Tagalog, ang kasuklam-suklam na kalapastanganan. Reference to the command of Caligula for his statue erected in Jerusalem. It was in this period of persecution that the book of Revelation written. That was at the time of we have mentioned that last week. Example, 666 as reference to the persecution also. Now, there are also mystery cults. The cult of the Greco-Roman Pantheon did not lead intimate and personal faith. And so the mystery religions fulfilled that longing and desire. A direct contact with the deity was a need of many people. Even in our religion, and for example, we as Christians, Catholics, we have that aspect, okay, of God who personally, that communication that we have with Him. And so in that time, that was also a problem. And then this was the solution. And some cultures had these, among them the cult of Cybele in the province of Asia, and that of Isis and Osiris in Egypt. There were among the mystery cults that existed in the time of Paul. These mystery cults entailed a community of equals, no class distinction, and thus, some way they fulfilled the longing of many people for social equity. When they're the rich and the poor, the mystery cults are the great equalizers. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, we know that Paul had to contend with regarding food that has been offered to idols in pagan worship. That could have been part of what they were doing in the mystery cults. Another point is the worship of the occult. It's a religious system which included various superstitious practices. There are powers everywhere, all places. Galatians 4:3, Paul writes, in the same way, we also, when we were not of age, were enslaved to the elemental powers of the world. So I talk about powers. And there's a worldview that the universe is filled with spirits and demons. The New Testament shared this worldview, at least the synoptics also. In the Gospels, we see Jesus casting out demons. Now, there was reliance on magic in order to invoke and to drive away demons. This is evident in the healing miracles. Now, even Jesus shared this worldview. In John, there's no reference, as we have mentioned last time. So it's one of the differences between the Gospel of John from the Synoptics and Paul. And so linked to this system are various practices like auguries, fortune telling, horoscope, astrology, sorcery, etc. And the cult of the saints, no, when it was being introduced, was an easy transition from the original worship of the occult. And then another movement, the Pharisaic Judaism. In studying the context of Christianity in the time of Paul, we have to posit the premise that Christianity was a movement within Judaism. This was a movement that Paul likewise had to contend with. This caused him the greatest agony. In fact, he was a Pharisee before. Other philosophies were only in certain places, but as Pharisaic Judaism was present in almost every place he went. And then, of course, the various philosophies. Many turned to the more rational paths. Instead of seeking answers in terms of deity, they found it in philosophy. And to these, they turned to when they had problems. And thus, they did not resort to supernatural deities. And here are the following schools of thought that were prevailing philosophies in the time of Paul, and traces of these find in his letters. So first, behind me, the picture of Plato. So there was Platonism at the time of Paul. Of course, Plato lived for that. So what do we see here in Platonism? The world of ideas as the real world. So the world that we have now, it's just a mirror of the world of ideas, which is eternal. And in Plato, we see dualism. The struggle is to escape the material world and reach the world of ideas. This is by reflection, meditation, thinking. And you have that word in Greek, episteme, that is knowledge, and that means education. Ignorance is one's damnation. And so the elite in Greece were the philosophers, men of speculation rather than action. And this is so different from the Judeo-Christian thought, where work is important. That is Platonism. And then there's another one, Epicureanism, from Epicurus, a philosopher from Athens, who founded his own school. And this was continued, founded by Lucretius, his apostle. And their tenet holds that pleasure or absence of pain is the highest good. There's often a misimpression here. When we speak about Epicureanism, that does not adhere to sensuality. In Epicurus, good is the fullest, longest satisfaction. Now, if it is abstinence that will give this, then it is the one up. Now, Philippians chapter 3, verses 18 to 19, Paul writes, "For many, as I have often told you, and now tell you even in tears, conduct themselves as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their stomach. Their glory is their shame. Their minds are occupied with earthly things." Now, here perhaps he was speaking about the Epicureans, because gluttony is one, not only, but not the only one, is one of the many expressions of Epicureanism. Now, for the Epicureans, the world exists by chance. No divine plan, no final goal, no absolute good. And therefore, the adage, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die, that appears also in the letters of Paul. And then that's one thing that we know about their philosophy. And so seek the longest and fullest satisfaction now, because there will be no tomorrow. Now, if seen at face value, it seems to be anti-religion. Now, as a philosophy, it was popular, and it appealed to many because there was not much need for speculation. It appealed to the heart, with pleasure as the goal. And there's no concept of sin, no concept of salvation, no final judgment, no immortality of the soul, no resurrection. Now, as a philosophy, this school of thought was begun by Zeno. Zeno is a Stoic, not to be confused with Zeno of Elea. And he is a native of Cyprus. And Stoicism is the opposite of Epicureanism. Okay, it holds that the world is controlled by an absolute reason, and nothing happens by chance, for everything happens because of absolute reason, and the highest good is conformity to what is reasonable. If in Epicureanism the focus is on emotion, in Stoicism the focus is on reason. So there should be no emotions. And therefore, an image that is used is that of the carpet. Everything seems to be a mess at the other side, but it is actually in order. We have to accept what happens in life. Everything that happens has to be accepted, not changed. Personal feelings and emotions have to be suppressed because they cause imbalance. Stoics thus advocates perfect control. Stoic attitude brought about a fairly high type of morality and appealed to many who good moral life. For example, among the senators in Rome, one of the greatest orators of the world in history, Julius Cicero. And then also we have an emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Okay. However, the doctrine cannot jive well with Christianity because there's no concept of personal evil or sin, because it downplays the role of the will in the human act. So there is no concept of personal responsibility, and therefore no room for metanoia, that version, no room for that. Everything happens for a reason. And the morality of Stoicism may be commendable, but it cannot be in congruence, accept that as philosophy. Why? Because there are some non-negotiables like freedom. Another one is cynicism, and this doctrine grew out of the teachings of Socrates. The highest good is to have neither wants nor desires. So self-sufficiency, that autarkia in Greek, God has outlined for us our paths. And the result of this is extreme individualism. I am sufficient unto my own. And we see that in Paul's letter, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8. Paul brings forward a different concept of sufficiency, okay, based on divine providence. So it's an attack against autarky. Moreover, he said, God is able to make every grace abundant for you, so that in all things, always having all you need, you may have an abundance for every good work. So God suffices. God is enough for us. In cynicism, there's no place for providence. So all you need to do is hard work. For Paul, there's a need for constant support from the Lord. Like his words, famous ones, I can do all things because of him who strengthens me. My God will fully supply whatever you need in accord with his glorious riches in Christ Jesus. And so really banging heads with cynicism. Now here also we strong concept of divine providence linked with sufficiency. It is the same when he wrote of the thorn in the flesh, which he followed up with, my grace is enough for you. This other doctrine, skepticism, you cannot be sure of anything. And this doctrine is traced from Philo of Elis, the first of the skeptics, emphasizing strongly on experience, which differs from one person to the other. So if it's good for me, maybe it's not good for you. Therefore, one cannot really know the truth, nothing objective. We find in skeptics a strong relativism. The good depends on the experience of each person. There's no standard of judgment except one's experience. And customs are variable. For example, in each country, what is good in one country may not be good in another. So, no objective norm of morality. The Sophists. Brown includes this group, but he says there is not really a sophist philosophy, but only sophist philosophers. Sophists were itinerant teachers. Although they taught for free, they expected to be sustained materially. In the first century, they emphasized material prosperity, and they were well trained in rhetorics. Sometimes, even if they do not have any content, they're able to convince. Why? Rhetoric. They're able to argue their viewpoints as a result of that. And sophist that is used still today, taking it from this group of philosophers, is something negative. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10, Paul was probably defending himself against sophists. For somebody will say his letters are severe and forceful, but his bodily presence contemptible. So Paul was not in a way, okay, like the sophists who were more engaging because of the way, because of the manner of speaking. He even admits this, especially in 2 Corinthians 11:6. Even if I am untrained in speaking, I am not so in every way we have made this plain to you in all things. Now, in contrast, the sophists were good speakers. One good speaker in Corinth is Apollos, a fiery speaker, eloquent in speech, able to attract a lot of people in Corinth. And this is in contrast, Paul, with even an incident of a long speech in Acts. In 2 Corinthians, Paul likewise defends himself. To my shame, I say that we were too weak. But what anyone dares to boast of, I'm speaking in foolishness, I also dare. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. That defense of Paul. And now we, after having studied the religious philosophical context, let's go to the world of Paul, the political context. So first, let's go to the Roman structure of governance. Would have wanted to go through once again the survey of history, but I think we have dwelt with that before. I didn't want to, but let's go to the Roman governance. First, we have the provinces, okay? These Roman territories that were annexed by the conquest. So we have Rome, that already an empire, and then when they conquered Gaul, which is now France, and then Hispania, now that Iberian Peninsula, no, especially Spain, these states are organized, and these are subdivided by province from the word provincere, okay, for the purpose to conquer, province, and that word has remained in our vocabulary in the present. Originally, it refers to military outposts set up for conquest. Later, it also referred to the places that were conquered. Now, within the Roman Empire in the first century, there are two categories: senatorial and the senatorial provinces and imperial provinces, and both are headed by a person named governor. What we have now, the provinces, they have governors. And I will not dwell deeply on this, but first there's the senatorial province, provinces whose citizens are loyal to Rome. So more settled, more stable, and military, Roman military forces, they're not present here anymore. Examples: Macedonia, Achaia, Corinth, Asia, Crete, and Spain. And I place them here because you would find them in scriptures. The governor in these provinces, proconsul, who is chosen by the Senate. And he's directly answerable to the Senate for the governance of the province. And he himself and has a senatorial rank. He administers the province rather independently. He is the primary Roman representative of the province. And so that the proconsul has a term of 1 year, and therefore he is changed annually. Example, okay, in Acts we find this certain proconsul Gallio. Okay. The second category, imperial province, they are more turbulent provinces marked by pocket rebellions, in different places, small ones. The governor of these provinces is referred to as prefect or procurator, depending on the nature of the task. He is the Roman representative to the province. If he exercises civil or military authority, he's called prefect or propetor. And an example of this is Pontius Pilate in Judea. And we know him from the Bible. Okay, a second category is the imperial province. If the primary function of the governor is to collect taxes, and so it's economic in nature, that's procurator. So the governor in the imperial province is directly appointed by the emperor himself. He's directly answerable to the emperor, not the Senate. And there's no term limit for the governor of the imperial province. As long as the emperor wants him in his post, he remains there. And so in Acts 23:24, Paul meets the governor Felix. In Acts 24:27 and Acts 26, there's the governor Festus. We read from Acts 23:24, Marcus Antonius Felix was the ancient Roman procurator of the Judea province from 52 to 60 AD. Okay, that's the referring to what we see in Acts 23:24. And this is not, of course, in the text. Felix's cruelty and licentiousness, coupled with his accessible bribes, that's his characteristic. Now, still, the imperial province under the governors, the provincial council, who advised him in matters of governing the province. So the New Testament mentions a lot of these provinces: Spain, okay, Gaul, Macedonia, Achaia with Corinth as capital, Asia with Ephesus as capital. So within the province, there's small Roman settlement for strategic purposes. And within the provinces, local autonomy in certain territories, like client kingdoms. In Asia, we have Pergamum. In Judea, we have the Herods. Okay, the Herods who were the lackeys of the Roman Empire. We have smaller units also, distinguish various other cities called free cities, enjoying local autonomy and self-governance. Among these are those that have long histories of governance and cities that have demonstrated loyalty. For example, Athens and then Antioch. Now, in these smaller units, in these cities, the people were allowed to pass their own laws. They were exempted from taxes. Roman soldiers did not occupy the city. And the highest category of the city is the colony. They're really small islands of Roman culture, of Roman law and governance. And they were allowed to pass their own laws and were exempted from tax. And some of these colonies were specified as veteran colonies, were veteran soldiers. Now, let's look at still the world of Paul, the socio-economic conditions. Okay. Socio-political, now economic conditions. So here's the Senate. Okay. Now, the existing policy in those times was to group together autonomous communities. People were usually organized into a civitas, Latin term, plural civitates. In Greek, it is polis, or in plural, polis. Okay. These are the ordinaries within the province. So how are these civitates organized? So there's the magistrate, head of the city, and under him is the council, in Greek boule, in Latin curia, and we still use these terms in the church. The curia is composed of the decurions. The magistrate is usually selected from the decurion who form the curia. And so it is the proper assembly who vote for the decurions. So the popular assembly is called ecclesia, or the Latinized ecclesia. The magistrate plus the decurions compose the elite of the city, the local aristocracy. Now, within the Roman Empire, the decurions represented an ordo, no? Plural ordines, order, a social class. And the two ordines par excellence were the senators and the equestrians. And another order is that of the decurions. So you already see this elite, okay? These three groups. Okay. Now, senators represented the council of elders. They were invested with legislative powers. We have our Senate, okay, in the Philippines. And it's based on this, okay? It's like an elder, an old person, senator, okay? They were invested with supreme legislative powers. They belong to important families. Many have had military experience. They would have contributed to the cultural projects of the emperor. And they were greatly educated or had considerable experiences in governing provinces. You see here behind me now, SPQR, okay? SPQR, and that is Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people, okay? Meaning to say that they were really set apart, a group that is the elite. Now, another group are the equus, horse. They were the Roman knights. They were wealthy landowners who could afford to ride horses in battle. And these were wealthy Romans who did not enter politics. And so we have the Roman aristocracy in these orders: senators, equestrians, decurions. Now, these are orders whose members were all men. But what about women? There were also the women of the elite. They were expected to live uneventful lives, unobtrusive of the affairs of men. They married very young. And we see in history strong women who operate behind the scenes. For example, in the Bible, in the Gospel of Matthew, we read about Pilate's wife. Wives were expected to be models of honor. They were expected to be faithful to their husband, univira, even after the death of the husband. They could inherit only 10% of their husband's wealth. Although some could be very rich, they received inheritance. Now, the members of the aristocracy are only few, but we come upon them in various parts of the New Testament. Sergius Paulus, proconsul of Syria, Gallio also. Among the local aristocrats were the Christian converts of Athens, Erastus of Corinth was a city treasurer. And each had to fulfill certain qualifications. Senators should have at least 250,000 denarii, and 1 denarius is equal to a day's wage. That's a lot. Equestrians, 125,000. Equestrians, 25,000 denarii. And the aristocrats in pre-industrial society preferred to keep their property in the form of land. They worked in cities while their tenants tilled their lands. And so manual work that is looked down upon by the aristocrats. Manual work was likewise despised by Plato. Today, this is not the way we look. So what we have today is a contribution of the Judeo-Christian tradition, a positive look at the manual work. 2 Thessalonians, Paul would say, he who does not work, not eat. Cicero, okay, he called those who were below the humiliores, okay, the filth or dregs of society. So this is a question that we ask ourselves now. How do we look at the poor today? Because these are the two social categories of the population of ancient Rome. Roughly the high and low caste be two general groups. The first division appeared at the end of the 2nd century AD. And who are these? Honestiores or the boni. And to this category, there was the emperors, senators, equestrians, decurions, and some other classes. So honestiores had many privileges. They could not be tortured and would be killed by beheading and not damnatio ad bestias or crucifixion. Damnatio ad bestias is to be killed among the beasts. Okay. Humiliores and is divided into the following groups. Okay. Wealthy merchants and traders, they may not be honestiores or boni. Artisans, unskilled workers, those under that bondage, slaves also. So the wealthy merchants and traders were the most fortunate, comfortable lives, upper class. They were barred from joining the curia because of their degrading livelihood, because they worked with their hands. They may be considered the upper middle class of the Greco-Roman society. Now we have the artisans, those engaged in the service of the industry. They're also fortunate. For example, Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla, they may be the middle class of today. For example, Mary, the mother of Mark, having her own home in Jerusalem. Lydia, the first European Christian, wealthy. Phoebe, a benefactress of many Christians, probably possessing some wealth. And then, together with all of them, bakers, butchers, barbers, moneylenders, innkeepers, carpenters. Now, in the eyes of the aristocrats, their work was servile. In the eyes of the wealthy merchants and traders and other artisans, they are proud of their work. They identify themselves with their work, and they are proud of what they. Now, these first two groups of humiliores organized themselves into collegia or guilds. So you have these groups of even actors guild from this, these different groups that we have. Now, usually they bore the name of god or goddess, and the meeting hall of the collegium served as a function room. And usually they would elect officers. So a collegium served as some kind of a mini republic, and they could not join the politics of the city. In a way, their longing for honor and esteem was satisfied in the collegium. We still use this word, college. That group, okay, in Rome, if you go there, there are these colleges. For example, Colegio Americano, Colegio Filipino. That's where those who are staying in Rome are together. They live there, and then they go to the universities. And our word college is from here, as well as colleague. Now, they're also unskilled workers. The livelihood of these people would depend on the work provided by the daily wage earners. They take whatever comes their way. And some possible employment opportunities also. Construction of buildings, those that we call peons. In Tagalog, we use that term, no? Mga peon. And then burden bearing, okay, cargador natin, no? And then messengers, animal driving, ditch digging, the disabled also, begging or support from the relatives. They're part of that. And then those under debt bondage. Now, technically, these people are not slaves, but their liberty is curtailed by the creditors because they're not able to pay. So you are in bondage because you have debts. Okay. So debt bondage seemed to be a widespread phenomenon in the first century Greco-Roman world. In those times, for example, the parable of the debt by Jesus. Okay. And then that's reflected even in the letters. And then finally, we have the lowest in status. Even some Greek philosophers consider slaves as subhuman because these slaves can be traded or sold. In terms of social standing, they are in the lowest rank. But in terms of sustenance, subsistence, and livelihood, they're better off than the other groups of the humiliores because of their rich masters. Their basic attitude is that they seem to have accepted their lot, and they're stoic about it. Example, okay? Let's see the letter of Paul to Philemon. Philemon was like this. Paul seems to have accepted slavery, or the letter of Paul to Philemon. Paul was saying, or we see that Paul seems to have accepted it as part of the way of life in those times. It's not condemning, but so that question, Paul does not seem to argue for the abolition of slavery. This is one issue. Why did he not argue for slavery to be abolished? Why? Because of his insistence on koinonia, his focus on that. That's fellowship, that community. And by focusing on this, Paul was undermining the foundation slavery was built. Okay. It's not that he's not against it, but he goes beyond it. Many of the slaves joined guilds and associations which ensured a decent burial for them. So these associations are called collegia tenuiorum, guilds of lower rank. So they give a small amount, a contribution, sometimes from their masters. They're allowed to meet only once, and the poor and the disabled could not afford this. So the slaves are better case, better even those who are poor and disabled. Now, some of Paul's converts were from the upper middle class and middle class. I was talking to you about this a while ago. Philemon, to whom he wrote, owned a slave. There are, however, indications that the communities in which he started as generally poor. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul was mentioning the poverties of the Macedonians and Achaeans. They probably could correlate with the sufferings of Christ. People thus are attracted to it. And the Christian message was attractive to the poor. And then we also go to the economic conditions of that time. What were the economic conditions in those cities? With regard to food, basic fare was bread baked from wheat. Sometimes corn was used as substitute. Food was not a problem for the wealthy humiliores and artisans, and neither was it for the slaves. What was the problem? More for the unskilled workers and those under debt bondage. Hunger was always a present threat. So in the first century, it was always difficult to be poor. So the collegia's purpose was not for charitable purpose. Wealthy patrons and benefactors did help, but this was not on a regular basis. The problem was compounded further when there was famine. Now, for the well-off, as well as for the first two groups of humiliores, shelters did not possess problem. This was also true for slaves. They lived in these households. It was more the concern of the unskilled workers and those who were under debt bondage. Some of the people in these groups were homeless, and they lived in small one-story huts outside the city. Those who had enough money could rent a room in the tenement buildings. And these tenement buildings are called insulae, like islands. They were nearer to the city center, but there was a building to collapse. So the lack of shelter carried with it more problems for the urban poor. There could be overcrowding in the places where they lived. There was often shortage in the water supply, with the danger for it to be polluted. There was high rate in morbidity and mortality. At this time, life expectancy was until about 40 years old. It's very low, huh? 40 years old. Now, so you have the house called domus, and within that domus, in the middle, there was a courtyard, like what you see in the picture. You see that in Philemon chapter, because that's only one chapter. So Philemon verse 2 and 20. Christians and guests would gather in the house of Philemon. In times of plague, which could easily retreat to their country estates until the illness is contained. So you see that now, whenever you read that, imagine something like this. Overall, we find the marked contrast between the humiliores and the honestiores. Honestiores do not have big problems. In contrast, humiliores face a lot of hardship. It was difficult to live poor in the first century. This is precisely one of the reasons why the message of the gospel preached by Paul reached many and was widely accepted. Go to an interesting part, the person of Paul. And we would deal here with an introduction to Paul, and then his go to the introduction. So this is like a biodata, curriculum vitae of Paul. So the name, his Jewish name is Saul, and then the Greek name is Paulos or Paul, Roman Paulus. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. 3:5. Birthday, okay, from it could be 1 BCE to 5 CE. So in between those, okay. So 1 BCE is 1 BC, and then to 5 AD. So you see that in Philemon 9, and then also Acts 7:58, when he was called the Neanias. Okay, birthplace, the city of Tarsus. Okay, province of Cilicia. Status single. Citizen Roman by birth. Religion Judaism. Religious affiliation Pharisee. Occupation tent maker. Language is spoken probably Greek, and then Hebrew and Aramaic also. That's because of his Jewish background. Educational background, basically in Jerusalem on the Jewish law under Rabbi Gamaliel. And then probably higher studies, okay, on Greek rhetorics and even Greek philosophy. Physical handicap, the thorn in the flesh, or the weaknesses, okay, that he had. Work experience, formerly a Jewish evangelizer. Now, who was he, Paul? He would be known to us with greater clarity and certainty compared with other authors and personages in the New Testament. Why? We know him directly through his letters, indirectly through the Acts of the Apostles. And with Paul, we have a lot of sources. Paul was a man of the city. Most of the activities of Paul were carried out in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, he was planning to go westward to Spain, to Rome, but he was unable to go to Spain because he was captured, imprisoned, and executed in Rome. Now, he was raised in Tarsus, Cilicia. Hellenistic cities were the backdrop of his life. So the dramatic spread of Christianity happened in these Hellenistic cities. Now, about his family, Acts 23:16, we know that Paul had a sister, also has a nephew, other relatives also. You see that in different parts, okay, of his letters, from letter to the Romans. Paul was religious. He was a Jew. Now, Jew is not an ethnic group, but a religious group. As to his religious affiliation, he was a Pharisee. Now, with regard to his work, both Paul and Aquila were tent. As to education, Paul had opportunities. For in Tarsus, there was a good university that could rival Athens and Alexandria. And from the text, we know that Paul knew the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's what we call the Septuagint. And Paul seemed to have a physical handicap, thorn in the flesh, weakness of the flesh. What are these? Scholars are still talking about. Now, citizenship of Paul, it was a citizenship by birth. Many of us, Filipino citizens, because we were born here. Now, he inherited the citizenship of his parents. There is speculation on the citizenship of his father or grandfather. It seems to be conferred citizenship, what we could call naturalized. But since he was already naturalized, then that next generation is already by birth. Now, the fact that he was a Roman citizen was important, providential. It was providential because it provided him escape from imprisonment and detention in the midst of his missionary work. He avoided punishment because of that. Punished, and then his citizenship saved him. The same was true in Acts 25, the setting which was at Caesarea. If Paul were not a Roman citizen, he probably would not have done the great. Now, no, he did. And it's a blessing that he is a Roman citizen. Okay? And because of that, Christianity spread very quickly. After presenting bits and pieces of the person of Paul, we now turn to the conversion of Paul. You're familiar with this, okay? We find this from the Acts of. We will not go into detail because we have seen this in part when we were studying the Acts of the Apostles. Anyway, here are the texts from Acts 9, Acts 20, 26, recounting of the conversion of Paul. So here are the texts. Acts 9, you will see that. Now Paul, one following. Now Saul, still breathing murderous threats against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters in Damascus, and so on. Okay, well up through verses 10, 11, 13, and then 15, 17, until 8. Okay, an account of his conversion. First one. Second one, Acts 22, when he was introducing himself. I'm a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia and brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel. I was educated strictly. Okay, I persecuted this way to death, persecuting in the way of Jesus. Okay, binding men and women, delivering them to prison. And then in verse 6, he would recount that on that journey, as I drew near Damascus, about noon, a great light from the sky suddenly shone and around me, etc. Okay, through 12, 17, 21. Okay, and then in Acts 26, beginning with the verse 9 following. Okay, so I myself once thought that I had to do many things against the name of Jesus the Nazarene, I did in Jerusalem. Okay, and so on. And he said, I imprisoned many of the holy ones with the authorization I received from the chief priests. And so in verse 12, on one such occasion, I was traveling to Damascus with authorization and commission of the chief priests. At midday along the way, O king, I saw a light from the sky, brighter than the sun, shining around me and my traveling companions. We fell to the ground still. So through verse 9, 14, 15, 17, then 18. Okay. Now, when we talk about these texts, okay, when we speak about conversion, it's quote unquote conversion. Okay. Why? We have to take this in a special sense. Since Paul did not move away from Judaism, okay, he did not say that I'm no longer a Jew. No, he continued to be a Jew. Why? Because Christianity was a movement within Judaism. Now, in the primary sources, we were talking about Acts of the Apostles a while ago. Now, in the primary sources, the most explicit part regarding his quote-unquote conversion is this. No, it's not the story that he tells in Acts, but Here's what he says. Now I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human being, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation to Jesus Christ. For you heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond and tried to destroy it, and progressed in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my race, since I was even more a zealot for my ancestral traditions. But here it is, when God, who from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal unto me that I might proclaim him to the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. Rather, I went to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Now, Paul calls it a calling, a moment of grace involving a revelation. He was then commissioned, ordered that I might preach to the Gentiles. And this is the most explicit in the text of Paul on his. There are other texts. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? See? 1 Corinthians 15:8. Last of all, as to one born abnormally, he appeared to me. 2 Corinthians 4:6. For God, who said, let light shine of darkness, has shown in our hearts to bring to the light of knowledge of the glory and the face of Jesus Christ. Is this conversion? Okay, that what he's referring to. The we or us is epistolary epistolary plural, meaning, yeah, it's like we also use that in Tagalog, no? It's something singular but plural. Kain na po ba kayo? Okay, like that. So 2 Corinthians, I know someone in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up to the third heaven. I know that this person, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard ineffable things which no one may utter. And this reference to Paul is a reference to Paul being brought to the third heavens. 1 Timothy also, according to the glorious gospel of the Blessed One, I'm grateful to him who has strengthened me. Okay, I was once a blasphemer, but I have been mercifully treated because I acted out of ignorance in my unbelief. Okay. Now, the significance of the conversion experience is something that we cannot overemphasize. It is the turning point in the career of Paul and his theology. There are three things are of significance in this event. First, a moment of radical transformation. Paul, a Pharisee who centers the law, he's transformed into an apostle whose center is Christ. So it is a metanoia in the sense of the word. Metanoia, a conversion. This conversion experience was a moment of undeserved favor, a moment of grace, gratuitous gift. It is in the conversion experience he experienced salvation. And salvation is not anymore through the law. It is grace. He realized that he did not deserve the transformation. And the conversion experience was a moment of mission. One's conversion or religious experience brings about zeal for the apostolate. Is it true for us that when we experience the Lord, that strengthens us, it makes us more enthusiastic? Apostolate. We go through the Pauline passages referring to the conversion, we see little. The focus is not so much on the external event, but internal experience. Even the external events is so difficult to describe. So it's more of what happens within. In Acts, we have more details. However, in both cases, the internal experience is very much emphasized. So there are two questions about the conversion of St. Paul. First, what is the nature of this experience? How did it really happen? Are the external details given in Acts historically reliable? Let's look at the nature of the experience, referred to as the quote-unquote conversion of St. Paul. However, some others prefer to call it as a call experience rather than a conversion experience, like the one of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and others. It is not a conversion because it's not leaving Judaism. rather an artificial discussion because the point is more on the radical transformation, the moment of grace, rather than a shift in religion. It is a conversion and the call experience. It is not an either or, but both and. Okay. So yeah, conversion, call, there, these elements. Now, is the Acts of the Apostles reliable historically? Or let's focus on the conversion. Did the conversion really happen as how Luke counts it? Probably not, because there are inconsistencies. Note the following comparison. In Acts 9:7, the witnesses heard but did not see. Acts 22:9, the witnesses saw the light but did not see anyone. See? They heard and then he saw the light. Okay. Acts 26:13-14, the witnesses both saw and heard. Which is which? And then there are inconsistencies that are questionable. Chapter 9, light that was flashing around him. 22, light that was shining around him. 26:13, shining around him also. So consistent. Other parts. Acts 9:7, the men stood speechless. Acts 22, there was nothing. Acts 26:14, they fell to the ground. Which is which? And some even go to the extent of harmonizing the text. They heard, okay, and then saw also. As to the authorization to pursue Christians, Acts 9 would say from the high priest. In Acts 22, high priests and whole councils. In 26:12, the chief priests. Now, at the time of Paul, there was no sanctioned persecution of Christians. Okay? The letter of the chief priests in Jerusalem would have no bearing in Damascus, and they would have had no authority there. And so it would be difficult to harmonize. So externally, we do not know what happened. In all of these, we have to avoid two extremes. One, that the three passages are pure literary fiction, a simple pious story. Avoid that because it has basis, okay? Or the other extreme is, okay, it's historically harmonized these three accounts to explain that they are a literal, blow-by-blow account of what really happened. Now, the book of Acts is neither of these two. They're a literary representation of a real historical event. Now, externally, it is hard to say what happened, okay? Paul and Luke really give us the essential, the internal meaning. The conversion of Paul was a moment of radical transformation, of undeserved favor, and a moment of commissioning. Radical, facing the very people who persecuted, a very difficult task for him. So he goes to the root. As a persecutor before, now he's persecuted, okay? Because he goes against that persecution that he was doing. Second, what happened after Paul's conversion also tells us about the forgiving attitude. They not only forgave him, they accepted him as not only one of them, but also one of their leaders. So you have Peter and then Paul. Go to the basilicas, Basilica of St. Peter, even St. Peter's Square, and then Paul. This concretizes the divine mandate in the Gospels. Love your enemies, pray for your persecutors. Third, our discussion on Paul's conversion is undertaken because of its importance for our study of Paul's theology. Many of the doctrines he preaches have their root in his conversion. And the dating of Paul's conversion makes it possible for us to trace and reconstruct the timeline. From the dating of his conversion, we are able to proceed to reconstruct the dating of other events. It's very important, okay? So not only theologically, but then also here, see the historical value of it, to see the timeline. So this is the thing that we'll deal with last, the person of Paul, the chronology of Paul's life, something very important for all of us. First, we see a reconstruction on the chronology of Paul's life, like a detective work. And where do we get this? The letters of Paul. And then we also use Acts of the Apostles to support it to some extent. Paul and Luke do not tell us explicitly when do the events occur. What we are left to do is to reconstruct the timeline. This is interesting work. So the first question is, when did Paul's conversion happen? So clues, Galatians 1. The sequence is from Galatians 1:15 is the following. Okay, so the conversion, 34 to 36, and then Arabia, and then Damascus. He was in Damascus for 3 years, and then Jerusalem. The first time was in Jerusalem. It's called that Jerusalem 1. Now in Acts 9:19, what is the sequence? The conversion, and then Damascus for some time, then Jerusalem. So only difference is that there was no visit to Arabia in Acts. Paul left Jerusalem because of a Jewish. In 2 Corinthians, Paul was able to escape. Many believe that this would be referring to the experience recounted in Acts 9:23 to 25. And this contains an important detail, okay? A crucial one, which makes it possible for us to know the date. Who was this? King Aretas. From the external sources, King Aretas died in 39 AD. So the escape must be before that. So Aretas was given control of Damascus, okay, by Caligula after the death of Tiberius. Now Aretas was in power from 37 to 39 AD. So the escape from Damascus happened between those 2 years. Now we go 3 years back, and thus date the conversion from about 34 to 36 AD. See, interesting. So the probable date was this. Paul's conversion was in 34 AD, and then he went to Arabia, then to Damascus, and his escape from Damascus happened in 37 AD. See, we already have that part. So in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1, Paul says that after 14 years, that is after 14 years after the conversion, I went up again to Jerusalem. So let's reconstruct it. CE means also AD, okay? 34, conversion. And then he went to Arabia. That date that's unknown. 34 to 37, he was in Damascus. 38, he was the first time that he went to Jerusalem. 48, okay, that was 14 years after the conversion, he was in Jerusalem the second time. We call that Jerusalem 2. So now, next question. What happened now in between Jerusalem 1 and Jerusalem 2? From the letters of Paul, there's little material found that regard this. Galatians 1:18 met Cephas and James. After that, Galatians 1:21, that would tell us that Paul went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. And this we can put in between Jerusalem 1 and 2. And from these few references, we do not find much in the letters of Paul. Then we go to the Acts of the Apostles. Acts 9:26-30, during the 15th day Jerusalem, he was able to befriend Barnabas. Okay. Now, if we follow Acts 9, we see that Paul first went to Caesarea and Tarsus. And this part of Acts confirms that what we find in Galatia, Syria, and Cilicia. We know from this that he also had problem with the Hellenists. So let's review again. 34, conversion, and then after that, Arabia. 34 to 37, Damascus for 3 years. 38, Jerusalem, okay, about 15 days. 39 at Caesarea, at Syria. And 40 to 44, Tarsus, Cilicia, to recuperate. And then 45, Antioch. 48, Jerusalem 2. So, see? It's detective work. In Acts 11:25-26, Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Paul, brought him to Antioch. It was in Antioch where the disciples were first called Christians. In Acts 11:26, Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch, and where they stayed for 1 year. Antioch, Paul was to start his missionary journey. And then Acts 11:25-26, Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Paul. He brought him to Antioch. Okay. Acts 11:27-30, that's a reference to another Jerusalem visit. So in the letters of Paul, there's no reference to this. Now, Paul could have been confused regarding this. The Jerusalem visit seems to be the council visit found in Acts 15. In Galatians, the council visit was the second visit to Jerusalem. Now, however, in Acts, it was not the council visit, but the famine visit. And this particular Jerusalem visit, quite problematic, scholars. Chronology, the first ones, reconstruction. Now, the next one is on the birth of Paul. So we assign it to the birth of Paul. You find that in order now, 1 BC, 5 AD. Clues to this. Paul was studying under Gamaliel. Probably that time he was 12 years old. Okay, that's one clue. Another significant date could be the execution of Stephen, about 32 AD. Okay, now let's look at this. The first missionary journey. So there's the Antioch to Antioch journey. Okay, here we're now in the journeys of Paul. So 46 to 48, and then Jerusalem 2, 49, Galatians 2, 1 to 10, okay, and then Antioch incident, Galatians 2, 11 to 14. Now, when we look at this, now Luke was very respectful of the apostles. In Acts, he did not put the reprimand of Peter by Paul. In Acts 15, the primary issue was still on circumcision. There was a dispute, and Peter and James defend Paul and Barnabas. James's recommendation of exempting non-Jews from the law did not only focus on circumcision, but also on dietary laws. Now, Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch with Judas Barsabas and Silas. Okay? Silas returned to Jerusalem. Now, note how some texts Silas to account for verse 40. Acts 15, verse 34 is a note by a scribe. So Paul in Antioch, and there's a dispute between Paul and Barnabas. They split over whether John Mark is to go on secondary missionary journey. Barnabas and Mark sail off, and Paul and Silas stay in Antioch. That's chapter 15, verse 35 of Acts. We've seen this before, but I'm looking at it from the point of view now of Paul. Now, let's go to the second missionary journey of Paul. Some notes here. The of Paul were Silas and Timothy, and these two will be with him in the journey until the end. Now, Philippi is important. Acts 16, 19 to 40, because it was the first European journey. So it's the first time that Paul crossed here, okay? And this is also in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2. Here are some notes on this second missionary journey. So Corinth, Acts 18:1 following, is also important because it was Paul's first visit this city in Corinth, something very dear to him. In Acts 18:2, we read of Aquila and Priscilla who were expelled from Rome. Now, this is a clue. Therefore, foundational visit could be safely dated at late 50 AD. Why? We know from extra biblical sources when the Jews were expelled from Rome. Okay. Paul stayed in Corinth for 18 months. And his stay here was important because it allowed him to settle down, to practice his trade, and then to write letters. The earliest letter, 1 Thessalonians, was written in Corinth. Now, some notes on the secondary journey still. There is a speculation that 1 Thessalonians was probably written about late 50 or early 51 AD. So even the letter we can date then. In 1 Thessalonians, the co-senders of Paul were Silvanus or Silas and Timothy. Now, the third missionary journey of Paul. Why did this journey take 5 years? Because he stayed in Ephesus very long. The upper country, he stayed in Ephesus for 2 years. In Acts 20:31, he would always go back to his Ephesus experience from 54 to 56 AD. Now, today it's believed that almost all of Paul's extant letters were written in Ephesus. Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1 Corinthians. Now, there's a problem, however, since Philippians and Philemon are captivity letters. Many scholars hypothesize about an Ephesian captivity. Was he there imprisoned? To Macedonia, Greece, Macedonia, Philippi, Troas, that part there, and then Troas, Assos, Mytilene, Chios, Samos, Miletus, and then Miletus, and then Kos, Rhodes, Patara, Tyre, via the south side of Cyprus, Tyre, Ptolemais, Caesarea, Jerusalem, back to Jerusalem. There were 2 years, really a lot of travel, 50. And that Macedonia, he wrote 2 Corinthians. And there were a lot of problems in Corinth, and Paul apparently sent Titus to Corinth as his representative. And they decide to meet in Macedonia. After a long digression, Paul and Titus finally reunited in Macedonia. And this reunion became the occasion of writing 2 Corinthians. Now, Greece. At Greece, Paul stayed for 3 months. And many scholars assume that Paul visited Corinth, and from Corinth, he wrote his last extant letter, the letter to the Romans, the last of the Protopolian Letters. In Romans 16:23, we read of Gaius, a Corinthian, and Erastus, city treasurer of Corinth. In 59 AD, Paul was in Jerusalem. From 60 to 61, in Caesarea. In 62, in Rome. In many of the maps you would see there, the journey from Palestine, from Jerusalem, and then to Rome. Now, in 64 AD, Peter and Paul were executed in Rome. We do not find this in scriptures. The image we have of Paul right in the heart of the Roman Empire was one of preaching, and that we read in the Acts of the Apostles. So that's the journey those were the journeys that he had. And it's so interesting to put these things together. Many times now we do not really appreciate Paul, but it would be good to have an introduction like this before we actually delve into letters, and that we will do for next week. So for this time, giving you the introduction to the study of Paul, I do hope that this will help a lot when we read his letters. God bless you all.